Welcome to Horror Echo. Hello everyone. I'm here to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. But before you do, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also, let me know in the comments where you're from and what time it is where you're watching. Now, get comfortable, relax, and let me take you on a journey into the unknown. It was supposed to be a simple getaway. Three old friends, tired from the demands of their daily lives, wanted nothing more than to escape the noise of the city for one night. Their destination, a secluded, historic house nestled in the woods of Pennsylvania. The house was old, nearly a century old, and had been abandoned for years. The kind of place people would avoid, yet for reasons unknown, it called to them. Chad, the adventurous one, insisted on finding the most isolated place possible for their weekend retreat. Sarah, the quiet and analytical one, was hesitant from the start but followed along for the sake of adventure. And then there was Michael, the skeptic, who didn't believe in ghosts, spirits, or anything that went bump in the night. The three of them, driving down winding, forested roads, finally arrived at the house just as the sun began to dip below the horizon. The house stood tall in the distance, shrouded in a mist that seemed to emerge from nowhere. The first thing that struck them was its silence. It wasn't just the absence of sounds, no birds, no rustling leaves. There was a complete stillness that made it feel as though the house had been waiting for them. As they unpacked their bags, the only noise came from the distant rumble of thunder, signaling an incoming storm. Inside, the house was as you might expect, dusty, cobwebbed, and abandoned. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and age. The wooden floors creaked under their feet, as though the house itself was groaning in protest at their presence. They were alone, except for the faint sound of wind outside, which only seemed to grow louder as night fell. After a light dinner and some casual conversation, the three friends decided to call it a night. The storm outside had grown more intense, the rain hammering against the windows as thunder shook the very foundation of the house. They settled into their respective rooms, each of them feeling a strange sense of unease that they couldn't quite place. But it wasn't until the lights went out that the real terror began. As the last of the daylight faded, the house seemed to grow darker, its shadows stretching longer and deeper. The storm outside rattled the windows, and the wind howled like something lost and desperate. Chad was the first to notice that the air in the house had turned cold, even though the weather outside was warm enough for a storm. He shrugged it off, blaming it on the old, drafty windows, but there was something about the chill that made him uneasy. Sarah, lying in her bed with the covers pulled tightly around her, stared at the ceiling. She had never been one to believe in the supernatural, but tonight, something felt wrong. The silence that had once been so peaceful was now suffocating. The wind whistled through the cracks in the walls, but there was something else. Something deeper. A faint tapping sound, almost imperceptible, came from somewhere above her room. Her heart skipped a beat. She listened more closely, but the sound stopped as suddenly as it had started. Meanwhile, Michael was already half asleep in his own room, trying to ignore the storm. He was the skeptic, the one who never entertained the idea that anything could be out of the ordinary. But the longer he lay there in the dark, the more he felt as if he was being watched. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind, every flicker of shadow seemed to draw his attention. He told himself it was just his mind playing tricks on him, but deep down, he felt the presence of something, or someone, else in the house. The storm raged on outside, and the power went out with a loud crack of thunder. Darkness enveloped the house, and the only light came from the occasional flash of lightning that illuminated the rooms in stark, eerie detail. They all lay there in the darkness, each of them too afraid to move, too afraid to sleep. Then, the tapping started again. It wasn't a faint sound this time. It was louder, more deliberate, like fingers rapping against the walls. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding, trying to locate the source of the sound. It was coming from above her room, but there was no attic. The house didn't have one. Just the thought of it made her stomach churn. Chad, whose curiosity often got the best of him, couldn't resist the urge to investigate. He got out of bed, stumbling through the dark, trying to find the flashlight he had tossed onto the nightstand earlier. After what seemed like an eternity, he finally found it and switched it on. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing the old wallpaper peeling away in places, the dust motes swirling in the air, and nothing else. He hesitated for a moment. The tapping had stopped. But in its place, something else had emerged, a low, rumbling sound that seemed to vibrate through the walls. Chad's heart raced. He stood there, frozen, unsure of what to do next. His curiosity pushed him forward, and with shaky hands, he turned the door handle and stepped out into the hallway. It was eerily quiet. The storm outside had quieted down, and the only sound now was the soft patter of rain against the windows. But as Chad moved down the hall toward the staircase, a chill ran down his spine. The tapping started again. This time, it was louder, closer. He turned to head back to his room, but then he saw something in the darkness. A figure, standing motionless at the end of the hallway. "Hello?" Chad called out, his voice shaky but filled with a mix of fear and defiance. "Who's there?" The figure didn't respond. It was just standing there, its features obscured by the shadows, but Chad could feel its presence. The air around him grew colder, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He took a tentative step forward, but the figure didn't move. "Chad, is everything okay?" Sarah's voice called out from her room, breaking the silence. He turned, startled by her sudden appearance in the hallway. Sarah had been as frightened as he was, but now she stood next to him, her eyes wide with fear. "I saw something," Chad whispered, his voice barely audible over the beating of his own heart. A figure, standing in the hallway. Sarah looked at him, confused. "There's nothing there, Chad. You're just imagining things." But Chad couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He stepped forward again, hoping the figure would disappear, but it didn't. As his flashlight illuminated the spot where the figure had stood, he realized with a sinking feeling that there was no one there. Before either of them could say another word, Michael's voice echoed from down the hallway. "Did you hear that?" Michael's voice was filled with panic. I saw something, too." Chad and Sarah exchanged uneasy glances. They all knew, deep down, that something was terribly wrong with the house. The three friends huddled together, their eyes darting around the dark hallway. The tapping had stopped, but the eerie presence remained, hanging thick in the air like an invisible fog. As the rain outside picked up again, the house seemed to groan and creak in response, almost as if it was alive. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm of fear brewing within the walls of the house. They were no longer alone. The question remained, what was watching them, and why had it chosen to reveal itself now? As they stood there, the cold feeling of being watched intensified. The silence stretched on, almost suffocating, each of them too afraid to speak, to move. The only sound in the house was the rain, now coming down in torrents, a constant battering against the windows. "What's going on?" Michael asked, his voice trembling slightly as he stepped closer to the others. His eyes darted nervously around the dark hallway. "We need to leave. Now." But Sarah shook her head. "We can't leave. Not yet. We don't even know what's happening here. It could just be an old house with creaky floors and drafts." Chad, however, wasn't convinced. The sense of dread was overwhelming. He had experienced enough strange things in his life to recognize when something was truly wrong. There's something in this house. And it's not just the storm. The house seemed to hold its breath in that moment, the tension thick and almost tangible. Then, just as quickly as the moment had started, the tapping returned. This time, it wasn't coming from above. It was coming from below. From the basement. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her eyes wide in terror. That's coming from the basement." Michael tried to force a laugh, but it came out strained. "It's probably just the wind or rats. Old houses have rats, right?" Chad was already making his way toward the stairs. "I'm going down there. I need to know what's causing it." "No!" Sarah protested, grabbing his arm. "We shouldn't go down there. Whatever is making that sound, we need to get out of this house." But Chad pulled away from her grip. His curiosity had taken hold, and there was no turning back now. "We need answers. We can't just leave without understanding what's happening here." With that, he began his descent into the dark, musty basement. The stairs creaked under his weight as he moved cautiously, each step echoing in the oppressive silence. The others hesitated but followed, unable to let Chad go down alone. As they reached the bottom, the air grew even colder. The basement was damp and smelled of mildew, the walls covered in layers of grime and peeling wallpaper. In the far corner, a dim light flickered weakly, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. The tapping grew louder. Chad's flashlight swept across the room, revealing the source of the sound, an old wooden chest. It sat in the corner, battered and worn with age, its surface scarred by time. The tapping was coming from inside. Is something inside there?" Sarah's voice quivered, her face pale with fear. "I don't know," Chad replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "But we're about to find out." He approached the chest cautiously, the light of the flashlight trembling in his hands. The closer he got, the more the tapping seemed to intensify, as if whatever was inside was growing impatient. With a sharp exhale, he knelt down and slowly lifted the rusty latch on the chest. The lid creaked open, revealing a dark, empty space inside. But then, something caught his eye. At the very bottom of the chest, beneath layers of dust and old fabric, was a small, tarnished key. It looked ancient, its surface worn down from years of use. Chad reached for it, his fingers brushing against its cold metal surface. The instant his fingers made contact, the basement door slammed shut behind them, and the sound of footsteps echoed from upstairs. The friends froze, their hearts racing. "Who's up there?" Michael shouted, his voice panicked. No response. Without warning, the lights above flickered, and a low growl vibrated through the air, coming from somewhere deep within the house. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the storm. It was something much darker, much more sinister. "Chad, what is that?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible as she clutched his arm. Chad didn't have an answer. He stared at the key in his hand, a sense of dread filling his chest. The tapping had stopped, but the oppressive presence of whatever was haunting the house seemed to grow stronger by the second. Suddenly, the basement light flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. They stood there in the pitch black, listening to the thumping of their hearts as the growling noise grew louder. The basement door had been locked from the outside. Chad's grip tightened around the key. "We need to find out what this is for." "What do you mean?" Michael asked, his voice shaky. "What do you think it opens?" Chad didn't answer. He had no idea. But deep down, he felt like this key was the answer to everything. Whatever had been trapped in this house for so long, it was connected to the key. They just needed to find the lock. A loud bang echoed from upstairs, followed by the unmistakable sound of something heavy scraping against the floor. "We're not alone," Sarah said, her voice rising in panic. The growling noise intensified, now mixed with the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate steps, like something, or someone, was moving through the house, getting closer. Chad looked at his friends, their eyes wide with fear. "Stay close. We need to find that lock. Now." They rushed toward the stairs, the growling and footsteps echoing behind them. The sound of the storm outside was nothing compared to the noises inside the house. Something was coming for them, and it had been waiting for far too long. The trio ascended the stairs as quickly as they could, the footsteps behind them growing louder with every passing second. Chad's mind raced, the weight of the key in his pocket seeming to grow heavier. What was it for? What had it unlocked? The answer felt so close, but the growing sense of danger was clouding his thoughts. The upstairs hallway was darker than ever, the only light coming from the occasional flicker of lightning outside the windows. The growling sound was getting closer, now unmistakably coming from behind them. It was low, guttural, and filled with an unsettling sense of malice. Whatever it wasn't human. "Chad, we need to get out of here," Sarah pleaded, her voice shaking. "This is insane. There's something in this house. I can feel it." Chad didn't answer her, his eyes scanning the hallway for anything that could explain what was happening. The light flickered again, and for a brief moment, he thought he saw a shadow move across the wall at the far end of the hall. But when he blinked, it was gone. "We can't just leave," Chad said, his voice firm despite the fear rising within him. "We need to figure out what's going on. This key, it has to be for something." Michael swallowed hard, his own fear growing palpable. "If it's for something, then let's find it quickly. I don't care what it opens. I just want to get out alive." The growl came again, this time closer, too close. The footsteps were unmistakable now. Someone, or something, was stalking them. They moved down the hallway, passing rooms that were filled with dust and cobwebs. The door at the end of the hall loomed ominously, its dark wood weathered by years of neglect. As they approached it, the temperature seemed to drop even further, the chill in the air biting into their skin. "This is it," Chad whispered, his voice barely audible. "I think this is where it all started." He reached for the door, but before he could turn the handle, a cold wind gusted from within the room, making the door creak loudly. Something moved on the other side. "Chad," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Do you hear that? Chad didn't respond. He slowly turned the handle, the door creaking open. What awaited them beyond was a small, dimly lit room. But it wasn't the room itself that made them freeze in place. It was the figure standing in the center of the room. A woman, pale as death, with long, tangled hair that seemed to writhe as if it had a life of its own. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, and the expression on her face was one of pure torment. She stood there, motionless, her mouth slightly agape, as if she had been waiting for them to come. The growling stopped. The house seemed to hold its breath. Who are you?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman didn't respond. But Chad could feel something shift in the air. The coldness that had settled into his bones deepened. The silence was suffocating. He stepped forward, his hand trembling as he reached for the key in his pocket. "I think she's the reason we're here," Chad said, his voice strained. "She's connected to this place. We need to find out how." Without thinking, he stepped into the room, holding the key tightly in his hand. As he did, the woman's eyes locked onto him. Her gaze was empty, hollow, but there was something about it that seemed to pull at him, as if she was trying to communicate something. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind them, trapping them in the room with the woman. The growling sound returned, this time louder than ever. It echoed through the walls, shaking the floor beneath them. It felt as though the house itself was alive, angry, and desperate to get rid of them. "What's happening?" Michael shouted, his voice thick with panic. Chad turned, his mind racing. There had to be something here, some way to understand what was going on. His eyes scanned the room, and that's when he saw it, the old, ornate chest in the corner of the room, exactly like the one from the basement. The tapping noise started again, louder now, coming from the chest. "I think it's connected to the chest," Chad muttered, his voice filled with urgency. "The key, it has to fit." Without waiting for a response, he moved toward the chest, his heart pounding in his chest. The woman's eyes followed him, unblinking, as if she were both watching and waiting. When Chad reached the chest, he knelt down, his hands shaking as he inserted the tarnished key into the lock. It fit, almost as if it had been waiting for this moment. He turned the key. The chest opened with a loud creak, revealing what was inside. A book! Old, worn, and bound in leather that had long since faded from its original color. There was something about it, something powerful, hidden in its pages. Chad lifted the book carefully, the weight of it strange in his hands. As he opened it, the room seemed to shift around them. The temperature dropped even further, and the growling grew deafening. The woman's voice broke the silence, raspy and filled with anguish. "You shouldn't have come. He's been waiting." Chad looked up from the book, his heart racing. "Who's been waiting? Who are you?" But the woman didn't answer. Instead, she disappeared into thin air, leaving nothing but a cold breeze in her wake. The growling stopped abruptly, and the room fell silent. In the distance, they could hear something, or someone, moving in the house. Slowly. Methodically. And it was coming for them. Chad's pulse hammered in his ears, the weight of the book still in his hands, its pages now trembling as if alive with a secret power. The woman had vanished, but the presence in the house was far from gone. They could feel it now, thick in the air, as if the house itself was closing in on them. The growling was gone, but there was something far worse lurking in the silence that followed. What did she mean? He's been waiting. Michael asked, his voice cracking as he backed toward the door, eyes scanning the darkroom for any sign of movement. I don't know, Chad replied, his mind racing as he stared down at the book. But whatever it is, it's not good. We need to find out what's in this book. Now? Are you kidding? Sarah's voice was full of terror. We need to get out of here before whatever that is, whatever we just saw, comes back. But Chad's gaze was fixed on the book. His fingers itched to flip through its pages, to uncover the dark secrets hidden within. Something told him that the answers were locked inside, and that the woman's warning was just the beginning. If they wanted to survive, they needed to know the truth. He opened the book, and as the pages turned, a cold gust of wind swept through the room. It wasn't just the wind outside anymore. It felt as though something was breathing right behind them. The air grew thick, suffocating. The book's pages were written in a language Chad didn't understand, but there were symbols and drawings that seemed eerily familiar. Faces. Eyes. Things that should not be. Chad, Sarah whispered, her voice filled with dread. I think we need to leave now. Whatever that thing is, it's coming. He didn't respond. He was too focused on the book. And that's when he found it. A drawing on one of the pages, a figure cloaked in darkness, its eyes hollow and its body twisted in unnatural ways. The text beside it was faint, but one word stood out to him. Zaloth. Zaloth. Chad muttered the name under his breath, his heart racing. It's the thing. The one waiting. The moment he spoke the name, the temperature in the room dropped to freezing levels. His breath fogged in the air. The walls of the house creaked as though they were buckling under some immense pressure. And then came the sound of footsteps. Slow. Methodical. The unmistakable sound of something, or someone, moving toward them from the other side of the house. Chad, we have to go. Michael screamed, his eyes wide with panic. But it was too late. The door slammed shut, trapping them in the room. The book flew out of Chad's hands, its pages fluttering wildly, as if caught in an invisible wind. And then, standing in the doorway, was the figure from the drawing. Zaloth. It was not human. It was something darker, an entity that seemed to radiate malevolence. Its skin was a sickly gray, its body unnaturally long, its limbs twisted and bent in ways that made Chad's stomach turn. Its eyes were wide, hollow, and black, like endless voids. It did not speak, but its presence filled the room with a suffocating dread. The air grew thick, suffused with an overwhelming sense of terror. Chad and his friends backed away slowly, but the figure did not move. It simply stood there, watching them with those empty eyes, its breath coming in shallow, rattling gasps. And then, just as Chad thought he could not bear the weight of the fear any longer, Zaloth moved. Not with speed, but with purpose. It stepped forward slowly, dragging its twisted limbs across the floor with a sickening scraping sound. The closer it got, the more the temperature dropped, and the more oppressive the air became. We need to do something, Chad whispered, his voice trembling. His thoughts raced. There had to be a way to stop it, a way to escape. He looked down at the book again, searching desperately for any hint, any clue. It was then that he noticed something written in the margins of the page, the word key. Underlined. His heart skipped a beat. The key from the basement, the one they had found earlier, could it be the answer? Without thinking, Chad turned and ran toward the stairs, the others following closely behind. The house seemed to groan and shake beneath their feet, the walls trembling as though the very foundation was being ripped apart. Zaloth's growl echoed behind them, but they didn't dare look back. They reached the basement door, but it was locked. Chad's hands shook as he fumbled for the key in his pocket. He could hear Zaloth's footsteps getting closer, louder, each one carrying with it a wave of suffocating dread. With trembling hands, Chad inserted the key into the lock. The door creaked open just as the first flicker of movement reached the top of the stairs. Zaloth was getting closer. They rushed down into the basement, and as soon as the door closed behind them, the growling stopped. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, but the air was still thick with tension. "Where now?" Michael gasped, breathing heavily. Chad looked around the dark basement, his mind racing. There had to be something. Something that would stop Zaloth from following them. His eyes scanned the room, finally landing on a strange wooden door at the far corner. It had the same dark markings as the book. "That's it," Chad muttered. "It has to be the way out." The growling started again, but this time it was distant. Far away. As if Zaloth had been momentarily stopped by something. Without hesitation, Chad rushed toward the door, the others close behind him. They didn't know what was behind that door, but they knew one thing for sure: they couldn't stay in the house any longer. Chad's pulse hammered in his ears, the weight of the book still in his hands, its pages now trembling as if alive with a secret power. The woman had vanished, but the presence in the house was far from gone. They could feel it now, thick in the air, as if the house itself was closing in on them. The growling was gone, but there was something far worse lurking in the silence that followed. "What did she mean? He's been waiting?" Michael asked, his voice cracking as he backed toward the door, eyes scanning the darkroom for any sign of movement. "I don't know," Chad replied, his mind racing as he stared down at the book. "But whatever it is, it's not good. We need to find out what's in this book. Now? Are you kidding?" Sarah's voice was full of terror. "We need to get out of here before whatever that is, whatever we just saw, comes back." But Chad's gaze was fixed on the book. His fingers itched to flip through its pages, to uncover the dark secrets hidden within. Something told him that the answers were locked inside, and that the woman's warning was just the beginning. If they wanted to survive, they needed to know the truth. He opened the book, and as the pages turned, a cold gust of wind swept through the room. It wasn't just the wind outside anymore, it felt as though something was breathing right behind them. The air grew thick, suffocating. The book's pages were written in a language Chad didn't understand, but there were symbols and drawings that seemed eerily familiar. Faces. Eyes. Things that should not be. "Chad," Sarah whispered, her voice filled with dread. I think we need to leave now. Whatever that thing is, it's coming." He didn't respond. He was too focused on the book. And that's when he found it. A drawing on one of the pages, a figure cloaked in darkness, its eyes hollow and its body twisted in unnatural ways. The text beside it was faint, but one word stood out to him. Zaloth. Zaloth. Chad muttered the name under his breath, his heart racing. It's the thing. The one waiting. The moment he spoke the name, the temperature in the room dropped to freezing levels. His breath fogged in the air. The walls of the house creaked as though they were buckling under some immense pressure. And then came the sound of footsteps. Slow. Methodical. The unmistakable sound of something, or someone, moving toward them from the other side of the house. "Chad, we have to go!" Michael screamed, his eyes wide with panic. But it was too late. The door slammed shut, trapping them in the room. The book flew out of Chad's hands, its pages fluttering wildly, as if caught in an invisible wind. And then, standing in the doorway, was the figure from the drawing. Zaloth. It was not human. It was something darker, an entity that seemed to radiate malevolence. Its skin was a sickly gray, its body unnaturally long, its limbs twisted and bent in ways that made Chad's stomach turn. Its eyes were wide, hollow, and black, like endless voids. It did not speak, but its presence filled the room with a suffocating dread. The air grew thick, suffused with an overwhelming sense of terror. Chad and his friends backed away slowly, but the figure did not move. It simply stood there, watching them with those empty eyes, its breath coming in shallow, rattling gasps. And then, just as Chad thought he could not bear the weight of the fear any longer, Zaloth moved. Not with speed, but with purpose. It stepped forward slowly, dragging its twisted limbs across the floor with a sickening scraping sound. The closer it got, the more the temperature dropped, and the more oppressive the air became. "We need to do something," Chad whispered, his voice trembling. His thoughts raced. There had to be a way to stop it, a way to escape. He looked down at the book again, searching desperately for any hint, any clue. It was then that he noticed something written in the margins of the page, the word key. Underlined. His heart skipped a beat. The key from the basement, the one they had found earlier, could it be the answer? Without thinking, Chad turned and ran toward the stairs, the others following closely behind. The house seemed to groan and shake beneath their feet, the walls trembling as though the very foundation was being ripped apart. Zaloth's growl echoed behind them, but they didn't dare look back. They reached the basement door, but it was locked. Chad's hands shook as he fumbled for the key in his pocket. He could hear Zaloth's footsteps getting closer, louder, each one carrying with it a wave of suffocating dread. With trembling hands, Chad inserted the key into the lock. The door creaked open just as the first flicker of movement reached the top of the stairs. Zaloth was getting closer. They rushed down into the basement, and as soon as the door closed behind them, the growling stopped. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, but the air was still thick with tension. "Where now?" Michael gasped, breathing heavily. Chad looked around the dark basement, his mind racing. There had to be something. Something that would stop Zaloth from following them. His eyes scanned the room, finally landing on a strange wooden door at the far corner. It had the same dark markings as the book. "That's it," Chad muttered. "It has to be the way out." The growling started again, but this time it was distant. Far away. As if Zaloth had been momentarily stopped by something. Without hesitation, Chad rushed toward the door, the others close behind him. They didn't know what was behind that door, but they knew one thing for sure: they couldn't stay in the house any longer. Chad's heart raced as he reached for the handle of the mysterious door. It was unlike anything else in the basement, old, sturdy, with strange symbols carved into its surface. The markings glowed faintly in the dim light, pulsing like some kind of heartbeat. A feeling of dread filled his chest as his fingers brushed the cool metal. "Are you sure this is the right choice?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She was still looking behind them, her eyes wide with fear. "What if it's just another trap?" "We don't have a choice," Chad replied, his voice filled with urgency. "We need to get out of here, or Zaloth will never stop hunting us." As the growling grew closer, louder, Chad pushed the door open. It creaked in protest, but eventually gave way. Behind the door was a narrow, stone-lined corridor, its walls damp and cold. It led deeper into the bowels of the house. The faint sound of wind could be heard from somewhere ahead, and there was an eerie hum in the air, like the entire house was alive. a sentient being breathing in time with them. Without another word, Chad stepped through the doorway, followed by Sarah and Michael. The door slammed shut behind them with a deafening bang, sealing them off from the basement and from whatever had been chasing them. The corridor stretched ahead, winding in turns and descending further into the darkness. The only source of light was the flickering flashlight in Chad's hand, and the further they went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The air felt thick, suffocating. Every step they took echoed through the silence, amplifying the fear gnawing at their insides. "I don't like this," Michael muttered, his voice barely audible. "I don't think we're getting out of here." "We'll find a way," Chad replied, his voice tinged with determination. But even he wasn't sure anymore. The deeper they went into the house, the more it felt like they were walking straight into the heart of the darkness. Suddenly, the hallway opened into a large chamber, its ceiling high and vaulted. In the center of the room was an altar, covered in what appeared to be old bloodstains. The walls were lined with ancient symbols, each one glowing faintly in the dark. There was a strange energy in the room, something dark and ancient that made the hairs on the back of Chad's neck stand on end. "What is this place?" Sarah whispered, her voice filled with awe and fear. "It looks like some kind of ritual chamber." Chad couldn't answer her. He was too focused on the altar. There, lying in the center, was a large, ornate box. The same kind of box he had seen in the basement, only this one was different. It was pristine, untouched by time, as if it had been waiting for them. "I think we're supposed to open it," Chad said, his voice heavy with a mixture of dread and curiosity. "No way," Michael said, his voice rising in panic. "We need to get out of here. Whatever this is, it's not worth it. We can't stay." But Chad was already moving toward the box. He couldn't explain why, but something in his gut told him they had no choice. The key, the book, the woman, Zaloth. Everything had been leading them here, to this moment. It was like the house was pulling them in, drawing them closer to whatever it was hiding. He reached the box and slowly lifted the lid. Inside was a mirror. A large, ornate mirror with a frame carved from blackened wood. The surface of the mirror was dark, reflecting nothing, no light, no images. Just an endless void. Chad felt a chill run down his spine as he stared into the mirror. It was hypnotic. The longer he looked, the more it seemed to pull him in, as though it were alive, watching him, waiting for something. His heartbeat quickened, and he felt a sudden compulsion to step closer, to reach out and touch the glass. "No, don't!" Sarah shouted, but it was too late. Before Chad could react, the mirror's surface rippled, like water disturbed by a stone. A voice, cold and ancient, filled the room. "Welcome, Chad." He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The voice was not human. It was deep, distorted, like it was coming from somewhere far beyond the house. It seemed to reverberate through his very bones. The mirror darkened, and for a split second, Chad thought he saw something move in its depths, a figure, tall and shadowy, standing just beyond the glass. It had eyes. Endless, black eyes. "You should not have come." Suddenly, the mirror shattered, sending shards of glass flying in every direction. Chad fell back, narrowly avoiding being struck by the jagged pieces. The room shook violently, the walls trembling as though the entire house were coming apart. "Chad!" Sarah screamed. "What did you do?" The ground beneath them began to rumble, and the chamber seemed to collapse in on itself. Dust and debris fell from the ceiling, and the air was thick with the smell of decay. And then, through the chaos, a figure appeared. Zaloth. But it wasn't the same. The creature that had stalked them through the house was now fully manifest, its form towering above them. It moved slowly, its limbs still twisted and inhuman, but its presence was overwhelming. The ground shook with each step it took, and the temperature dropped to unbearable levels. "You have unleashed me," Zaloth intoned, its voice low and echoing. "Now you will pay the price." Chad's mind raced. The mirror, the altar, the key, it had all been leading them to this. The house, the entity, had been waiting for them to open the door. To let Zaloth free. But it wasn't too late. Not yet. "Run!" Chad shouted, grabbing Sarah's arm and pulling her toward the exit. The room was collapsing around them, the walls crumbling as Zaloth moved toward them, its hollow eyes fixed on their every move. But as they ran, the ground beneath them began to crack, splitting open like the jaws of some ancient beast. They reached the hallway, but the way out was blocked by a wall of shadows. Zaloth was everywhere now, its presence filling every inch of the house. The air was thick with its power, and they could feel it closing in, suffocating them. "This isn't over," Chad said, breathless. "We still have a chance." But with each passing second, the house seemed to pull them deeper into its grip. Whatever Zaloth was, whatever it had become, it wasn't just an entity. It was the house itself. The house had been alive, and now it was hungry. The walls seemed to pulse, as if the very structure of the house was alive and breathing. Each thundering step Zaloth took reverberated through the ground beneath them, shaking the house to its core. Chad, Sarah, and Michael pressed forward, their feet slipping on the debris that was quickly accumulating around them. The house was collapsing in real time, as if the house itself was furious at their intrusion. Chad's mind raced. What was the next step? What could stop Zaloth? The book, the mirror, it had all led them here, but nothing they had done so far had worked. They were running out of time. "We can't keep running," Chad gasped, breathless from the sprint. "We need to find the heart of this place, the source of it all." "Where?" Michael shouted, his voice cracking. "The place is falling apart. It's going to bury us alive." But Chad didn't answer. His eyes were scanning the crumbling walls, searching for something, anything, that could give them a way out. The growls and screeches of Zaloth's approach grew louder, the air around them vibrating with its presence. In that instant, something caught his eye. A door. Small and unassuming, tucked behind a fallen piece of stone, just barely visible in the shadows. It was different from all the other doors they had passed. It didn't look like it belonged to the house at all. The wood was dark and glossy, the carvings on it intricate and unusual. "This way!" Chad shouted, grabbing Sarah's hand and pulling her toward the door. They sprinted down the hall, the growling now deafening. Zaloth was close, so close. Chad could feel the creature's presence bearing down on them, its hunger palpable in the air. With every step, they were closer to being consumed by it. They reached the door. Chad didn't hesitate. He threw it open, his heart pounding in his chest. The room beyond was unlike any other. It was an underground chamber, vast and cavernous. There was no sign of the house's decay here. Everything was pristine, untouched by time. The walls were lined with strange symbols, glowing faintly in shades of blue and green, casting an ethereal light over everything. In the center of the room was a large stone pedestal, and on top of it was a dark orb, pulsating with an ominous energy. "That's it," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "That's the source. The heart of this place." Chad could feel the power emanating from it. It was alive. It was as if the house itself was feeding off the orb. The orb was what had brought Zaloth into the world. And now, the only way to stop it was to destroy the source. "We need to destroy it," Chad said, stepping forward, but Sarah stopped him. "Wait. If we destroy it, what happens to the house?" "To Zaloth?" she asked, fear clouding her voice. "What if it makes things worse?" There was no time to debate. The growls grew louder. Zaloth was at the door, its massive form shaking the walls of the chamber. The sound of its approach was terrifying, and it wouldn't be long before they were trapped. "We don't have a choice," Chad snapped. "We have to do it now." He reached out, his hand hovering over the orb, his fingers trembling with a mix of fear and resolve. He could feel the power pulsing beneath his skin, as if the orb were alive, reaching back, trying to stop him. "Chad, no!" Michael shouted, but it was too late. With one swift motion, Chad slammed his hand onto the orb. The moment his palm made contact, the room seemed to collapse in on itself. The air crackled with energy, and a blinding light erupted from the orb, engulfing them in its brilliance. A deafening roar erupted in the chamber, a scream so pure and primal that it shook them to their very core. Zaloth's furious wail echoed in their ears as the energy from the orb tore through the house. Chad felt his body being ripped apart by the intensity of the light. It was as if the very essence of his being was being shredded and remade. He screamed, but the sound was lost in the storm of energy around him. He could hear Sarah and Michael crying out in panic, their voices distant and fading. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the light was gone. Chad collapsed to the floor, his body aching, his mind dizzy from the overwhelming force of what had just occurred. He could feel Sarah's hand gripping his arm, pulling him up, but he could barely comprehend what was happening. His vision swam, his thoughts were a blur. "Chad," Sarah's voice was frantic. "Chad, are you okay? Please, talk to me." It took a moment for his senses to return, but when they did, Chad looked around in disbelief. The chamber was gone. The pedestal, the orb, everything was gone. They were no longer in the underground chamber. Instead, they found themselves back in the house, the hallway now eerily silent. It was over. The house seemed to be still. The oppressive energy that had filled the air was gone, replaced by a strange calm. The walls no longer shook, and the temperature returned to normal. Even the growling and thundering footsteps of Zaloth were no longer there. But the house wasn't the same. The walls were still damaged, the foundation cracked and broken, but there was no longer a sense of danger in the air. It felt abandoned. "We did it," Michael whispered, his voice hoarse. "We stopped it." Chad nodded, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. They had destroyed the orb, but the house was still standing. There was no sign of Zaloth, but the weight of what had happened lingered in the air. "We need to get out of here," Sarah said, pulling at his arm. "Now." Without a word, they turned and fled through the house, not looking back. The storm outside had passed, and the morning light began to filter through the windows as they reached the front door. The air felt lighter, less suffocating. As they stepped out into the daylight, they turned back to look at the house one last time. It was still there, looming in the distance. Silent. Waiting. As if it had never been touched. But for now, they were free. Chad, Sarah, and Michael stood at the edge of the property, gazing at the house that had nearly destroyed them. The morning sun filtered through the broken clouds, casting a soft glow over the remnants of the structure. It looked almost peaceful now, its dark presence softened by the light, but the memory of what they had endured haunted them like a shadow. "I don't understand," Sarah whispered, her voice still shaky. "How is it still standing? We destroyed the source." "We may have destroyed the orb," Chad said, his voice low, "but the house, it's not just about the orb. It's the place itself. Whatever is here, whatever evil is tied to this land, it's deeper than just that thing." Michael took a deep breath, looking back at the house one final time. "Do you think it's really over?" His question hung in the air, uncertain. Chad looked at his friends, their faces pale but determined. They had come so close to losing everything, and yet they had survived. "I don't know. But whatever happens, we can't come back here. This place is cursed. We've done what we could." The wind picked up, rustling the leaves of the trees around them, as if the house were whispering its farewell, or perhaps a warning. It felt like the calm before another storm. "Let's go," Sarah said, pulling her jacket tighter around her shoulders. "Let's leave this behind and never look back." They walked away from the house, their steps slow but resolute, until the sight of it was nothing more than a distant silhouette against the horizon. But even as they moved further away, Chad couldn't shake the feeling that the house was still watching them, its empty windows like eyes, waiting for them to turn back. Hours passed as they made their way through the thick woods surrounding the property. By the time they reached their car, the sun had fully risen, bathing everything in warm light. It felt like a new day, as if they had somehow escaped the nightmare they had endured. As they drove away, the house slowly disappeared from view, its towering form becoming just another fading shadow on the horizon. But Chad couldn't forget what he had seen, the strange symbols in the chamber, the growl of Zaloth, and the way the house seemed to breathe. He didn't know if it was truly over. He didn't know if they had truly escaped the curse of the old timber house. But for now, they were free. The road ahead was long, and the memories of that night would stay with them forever, burned into their minds like a scar that would never fade. They had faced something that most would never believe in. They had survived a darkness that few could understand. And though they would move on with their lives, the house would never fully leave them. In the quiet of their car, as they drove towards safety and away from the horrors they had faced, they knew one thing for certain. The house was still out there. Watching. Waiting. And perhaps it always would be. As they drove further into the distance, the landscape began to shift, the trees thinning, and the light of the morning growing brighter. The tension that had gripped their hearts since their arrival seemed to slowly release with every passing mile. Yet, despite the fading memory of the house, a chill lingered in the air, a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. The kind of cold that seeps deep into your bones, making you question whether you're truly free from the horrors that once held you captive. Chad couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something had been left behind. What if it's not over? Michael's voice broke the silence, his tone strained, as if he could sense it too. What if it comes after us again? Chad looked at his friends, their faces pale and worn, haunted by the same fear that he couldn't escape. "We have to believe it's over. We stopped it. The house, it's just a house now. A ruin. Nothing more." But his words felt hollow, even to him. There was something gnawing at the back of his mind, a gnawing feeling that told him the timber house wasn't done with them yet. It had been waiting for so long, after all. Was the destruction of the orb enough to banish the darkness, or had they only delayed its inevitable return? As the car sped along the empty road, Chad stole one last glance out the window, half expecting to see the house in the rearview mirror. But all he saw was the road, the trees, and the open sky. Then, just as they rounded a bend in the road, Sarah gasped and pointed to the horizon. "Look," she shouted, her voice filled with panic. Chad slammed the brakes, his heart racing. He followed her gaze, his breath catching in his throat. In the distance, through the trees, there was a shape. A silhouette that shouldn't have been there. A figure. Tall and twisted, standing in the clearing, watching them. For a split second, Chad was sure it was Zaloth, that he hadn't truly escaped. His mind screamed in terror as he reached for the door handle, his fingers shaking. But then the figure vanished, like smoke in the wind, dissolving into nothingness. "Did you see that?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. It wasn't real. It couldn't have been." Chad's mind raced. He could still feel the weight of that gaze, the piercing eyes of something that shouldn't be. A shadow of what had haunted them, still out there. He wanted to tell Sarah that it was just a trick of the mind, that the darkness had no hold on them anymore. But deep down, he knew the truth. It wasn't over. The timber house was still out there, somewhere, waiting. And it always would be. Thank you for listening to today's story. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Horror Echo. Let us know if you've ever had a similar experience. We'd love to hear your story. Sweet dreams, if you can sleep.